August 1986. When Billy Hudson came screeching into the sheriff's department on the night of August 8th, his cherry-red Firebird came within a hair's breadth of sideswiping the prized Cadillac belonging to Sheriff Andrew Lutz. When he heard the squealing of tires, Sheriff Lutz looked up from the outdated magazine he had been absent-mindedly thumbing through. He saw the fender of Billy's Pontiac coming towards the driver's side door of his caddy and was out of his desk and halfway through the station in one swift, fluid motion. What the blazing hell was Billy thinking? Lutz thought with a look at his scuffed metal watch. It was barely minutes into Saturday morning, and Lutz's first inclination was that the young man had been drinking. What kind of drunk driver willingly drives himself into police custody? Before the wheels of the Firebird had come to a full stop, the driver's side door swung open and Billy Hudson tumbled out, falling to his knees before stumbling back to his feet. They're dead!" Billy shouted breathlessly as he struggled for balance. Lutz's mouth was already open to chastise Billy for nearly smashing in the door of his Cadillac, but at Billy's words, his jaws snapped shut with an audible click. Lutz took note of the scene before him. He had been sheriff of Richmond County for more than 10 years, having won re-election twice after Sheriff Bradley retired back in '75. In a county with 40,000 inhabitants spread over 400 square miles, he spent most of his time on the highways and so was well acquainted with Billy Hudson and his group of gearheads. Billy was a polite kid, always respectful, but that wasn't always the case with the young people of the town. The local teenage boys were entirely obsessed with their cars and could often be found on one lonely country road or another late at night, drinking and drag racing and having a generally wild time. They weren't bad kids necessarily. There just wasn't much else to do in an area that was almost entirely given over to corn and soybean fields. At least once a month, Lutz or one of his deputies would have to go out and disperse the group once they got too rowdy and began blasting the speakers on their stereos loud enough to wake the long-suffering farmers in the area. With a sinking heart, he thought he knew what might have happened. "Which one of you hit them? Where is the accident?" He reached for the walkie-talkie at his hip, but Billy shook his head vehemently. "No one hit them, Sheriff. We weren't racing tonight. Stu Lennox is in deep shit with his daddy for wrecking his brand new Ford." "And get to the point, Billy," Lutz growled. "Sorry, sir." Billy started talking so quickly his words tripped over one another as they raced to get out, and he had to take a deep breath before continuing. "No one was racing tonight, Sheriff. I was out with Molly Green. She lives over in Oakville. We went to the drive-in, and I took her home. On the way back, I decided to take old Highway 99. I like how peaceful it is out there at night." Wanted to disturb the peace by revving up the Pontiac away from the troopers on the state highway is more like it, Sheriff Lutz thought, but didn't voice out loud. "Anyway, I was over by the McGuire place, you know, that big patch of woods out by that farm. I was driving out there and I thought I saw something cross the road, like a dark shadow, bigger than a bear. Scared the shit out of me. I nearly lost control of the car." "There aren't any bears around here, son," the sheriff replied skeptically. "Sure it wasn't a deer?" "It wasn't no damn deer, sir. It moved like a cat, but it was hunched and sloping like a bear. I only saw it for a second, but it definitely wasn't any deer I ever seen. It was taller than the roof of my car." What nonsense was this? Lutz ran a hand through his dark, thinning hair and looked down. It was then that he noticed the blood spattering Billy's dusty work boots and the hems of his jeans. Backing slowly away from the young man, he edged his right hand ever so closer to the revolver holstered at his hip. He began eyeing the red Pontiac for dents and scratches, assuming this story of an animal was nothing more than misdirection. Finding none, he turned carefully back to the young man, maintaining a distance of 10 feet. "Okay, Billy, you've got about 12 seconds to start making sense before we start to have a problem. Why are you saying that the McGuires are dead? Whose blood is on your shoes, son?" "I was trying to tell you, Sheriff. I was driving out on old Highway 99 and I saw this big hulking shape cross the road. I don't know what it was, sir, honest, but it spooked me bad enough that I nearly skidded out. When I finally got the car stopped on the shoulder, I looked around, but whatever it was had disappeared into that patch of forest next to the McGuire plot." "I figured the same as you, sir," Billy continued. "Thought I was just seeing things late at night. But then, in my headlights, I could see some kind of liquid on the road, like oil. Except when I looked again, it wasn't oil. It was blood." "Is it possible this animal, or whatever you saw, could have been wounded?" the sheriff asked. "That's the first thing I thought too, Sheriff. And I hopped out of the car and grabbed my Winchester rifle from the trunk. Figured I could at least put the poor creature out of its misery. But when I got closer to the blood on the road, when I got closer, Billy started stuttering, and it was as if all the strength in his legs gave out. He sank almost gracefully to his knees, his oil-stained blue jeans sinking into the soft grass of the station's lawn. "Out with it, son. What did you see?" Lutz asked. He was trying to be patient, but it was also imperative that they get to the scene of any crime as fast as possible.
Billy took a deep, shaking breath. "An arm, sir. On the side of the road, just beyond my headlight, was a lady's arm, ripped off at the elbow. It was still wearing a wedding band." At the turn of events his previously peaceful evening had taken. Then he squatted down on his haunches next to the trembling young man. Out of habit, Lutz sniffed the air around Billy Hudson's head, almost hoping for the telltale whiff of whiskey or gin. But there was nothing. Lutz turned and walked back into the sheriff's department. "Clarkson?" he bellowed for his senior deputy. A moment later, Henry Clarkson's head popped out of his small office. "Sheriff." Thank goodness it was Clarkson on duty tonight. Clarkson was a calm and capable officer, excellent in tense situations. The only African American on the force, Henry Clarkson had a booming voice and a deep-barreled chest that could be used to great effect on unruly suspects. But he also possessed a logical mind that ticked through every possible scenario before taking any action. Thank God it isn't Miller, Lutz thought again, this time in relief that it wasn't his younger, jumpier deputy sharing the station tonight. "Is the cruiser gassed up? Good. Grab the rifle and the shotgun and get some flashlights as well. We're going out to Highway 99. Something may have happened over at Bud McGuire's place." An additional benefit, Clarkson followed orders without peppering him with dozens of questions. The deputy nodded shortly and turned to do as asked. In the meantime, Lutz went back outside and squatted down next to Billy Hudson, who was still kneeling on the lawn, his head in his hands. Lutz's mouth had a sour taste, and he longed for a cigarette. "It's okay, Billy. You did good, son. It's okay. Just breathe." Andrew Lutz murmured this litany over and over, remembering as he did the way his own father used a similar technique to calm skittish horses. Sure enough, after a minute or two, Billy Hudson's breathing began to slow. and the rigid tension along his spine relaxed. Billy took one or two more slow, rattling breaths and looked up at the sheriff. "After I found the arm, I went into the house," he said with grim resolve. I can't explain it, sir, but something horrible happened in there. I'd like to go home now, please, if that's okay." Sheriff Lutz wanted to tell Billy Hudson that he could go home, have a hot shower and a stiff drink, but it wasn't meant to be. "Sorry, Billy. We need you to show us exactly where all of this happened. There aren't any lights out there. We'll drive right past it in the dark."
August 1986. When Billy Hudson came screeching into the sheriff's department on the night of August 8th, his cherry red Firebird came within a hair's breadth of sideswiping the prize Cadillac belonging to Sheriff Andrew Lutz. When he heard the squealing of tires, Sheriff Lutz looked up from the outdated magazine he had been absent-mindedly thumbing through. He saw the fender of Billy's Pontiac coming swinging towards the driver's side door of his caddy and was out of his desk and halfway through the station in one swift, fluid motion. What the blazing hell was Billy thinking? Lutz thought, with a look at his scuffed metal watch. It was barely minutes into Saturday morning, and Lutz's first inclination was that the young man had been drinking. What kind of drunk driver willingly drives himself into police custody? Before the wheels of the Firebird had come to a full stop, the driver's side door swung open and Billy Hudson tumbled out, falling to his knees before stumbling back to his feet. "They're dead!" Billy shouted breathlessly as he struggled for balance. "The McGuires! I think they're all dead!" Lutz's mouth was already open to chastise Billy for nearly smashing in the door of his Cadillac, but at Billy's words, his jaws snapped shut with an audible click. He took note of the scene before him. He had been sheriff of Richmond County for more than 10 years, having won re-election twice after Sheriff Bradley retired back in '75. In a county with 40,000 inhabitants, spread over 400 square miles, he spent most of his time on the highways and so was well acquainted with Billy Hudson and his group of gearheads. Billy was a polite kid, always respectful, but that wasn't always the case with the young people of the town. The local teenage boys were entirely obsessed with their cars and could often be found on one lonely country road or another late at night, drinking and drag racing and having a generally wild time. They weren't bad kids necessarily. There just wasn't much else to do in an area that was almost entirely given over to corn and soybean fields. At least once a month, Lutz or one of his deputies would have to go out and disperse the group once they got too rowdy and began blasting the speakers on their stereos loud enough to wake up the long-suffering farmers. With a sinking heart, he knew what might have happened. "Which one of you hit them? Where is the accident?" He reached for the walkie-talkie at his hip, but Billy shook his head vehemently. "No one hit him, Sheriff. We weren't racing tonight. Stu Lennox is in deep shit with his daddy for wrecking his brand-new Ford and—" "Get to the point, Billy," Lutz growled. "Sorry, sir." Billy's began talking so quickly his words tripped over one another as they raced to get out, and he had to take a deep breath before continuing. "No one was racing tonight, Sheriff. I was out with Molly Green. She lives over in Oakville. We went to the drive-in and I took her home. On the way back, I decided to take old Highway 99. I like how peaceful it is out there at night." Wanted to disturb the peace by revving up the Pontiac away from the troopers on the state highway is more like it, Sheriff Lutz thought, but didn't voice out loud. "Anyway, I was over by the McGuire place. You know that big patch of woods out by that farm? I was driving out there and I thought I saw something cross the road, like a dark shadow bigger than a bear.
It scared the shit out of me. I nearly lost control of the car." "There aren't any bears around here, son," the sheriff replied skeptically. "Sure it wasn't a deer?" "It wasn't no damn deer, sir. It moved like a cat, but it was hunched and slooping like a bear. I only saw it for a second, but it definitely wasn't any deer I ever seen. It was taller than the roof of my car." What nonsense was this? Lutz ran a hand through his dark, thinning hair and looked down. It was then that he noticed the blood spattering Billy's dusty work boots and the hems of his jeans. Backing slowly away from the young man, he edged his right hand ever so closer to the revolver holstered at his hip. He began to eye the red Pontiac for dents and scratches, assuming this story of an animal was nothing more than misdirection. Finding none, he turned carefully back to the young man, maintaining a distance of 10 feet. "Okay, Billy, you've got about 12 seconds to start making sense before we start to have a problem. Why are you saying that the McGuires are dead? Whose blood on your shoes, son?" "I was trying to tell you, Sheriff. I was driving out on Old Highway 99, and I saw this big, hulking shape cross the road. I don't know what it was, sir, honest, but it spooked me bad enough that I nearly skidded out. When I finally got the car stopped on the shoulder, I looked around, but whatever it was had disappeared into that patch of forest next to the McGuire plot. I figured the same as you, sir. Thought I was just seeing things late at night. But then in my headlights, I could see some kind of liquid on the road, like oil. Except when I looked again, it wasn't oil, it was blood." "Is possible this animal or whatever you saw could have been wounded?" the sheriff asked. "That's the first thing I thought too, Sheriff, and I hopped out of the car and grabbed my Winchester rifle from the trunk. Figured I could at least put the poor creature out of its misery. But when I got closer to the blood on the road, Billy started stuttering, and it was as if all the strength in his legs gave out. He sank almost gracefully to his knees, his oil-stained blue jeans sinking into the soft grass of the station's lawn. "Out with it, son. What did you see?" Lutz asked. He was trying to be patient, but it was also imperative that they get to the scene of any crime as fast as possible. Bud McGuire had been expelled in 10th grade and was just in time to be swept up by the Vietnam War 2 years later. No one quite knows what he got up to over there, but when he returned to the town in '75, it was as if a blanket of rage had settled itself on Bud's shoulders. His father had died of cancer while he had been deployed, and Bud took over his family's 100 or so acres. This small farm had barely have been enough to keep them food in their bellies and clothes on their backs, but it had been in the family for 3 generations. The girl's eyes had been sky blue as they looked into his with an unreadable expression. April. This had been little more than an exhale of breath, and Lutz had been about to ask her to repeat herself when the girl's eyes had focused on something behind his shoulder and widened with alarm. Lutz had turned to see Bud McGuire standing a few paces behind them. His black eyes were just as blank and soulless as when he had gazed upon that dying dog. Leaning with casual menace on his shoulder, pointed at the sky, was a double-barreled shotgun with a long, sleek muzzle. Lutz had thankfully resisted the urge to startle at the sight of the burly man. "Morning, Bud," he had said. With slow, deliberate movements,
Lutz had moved his hand to the pistol hoisted at his hip and thumbed open the clasp. Bud had noticed, as he was meant to. His mouth twisted in a scowl, he had replied, "You're not welcome here," he had said in a flat, toneless voice, and Lutz had realized this was the first time he was hearing Bud speak. "I'll be leaving shortly," Lutz had replied in an authoritative tone. "People have been wondering how you two have been getting on up here by yourselves all winter. Thought I'd come over and make sure everything was okay." "Fine, you've seen. Now go." And with that, Bud had crossed the short distance between him and his new wife. Lutz had waited for him to hit her. If he did, then the deputy could bring him into the station. But Bud just stood a few feet from the girl with a look of pure fury on his face. April McGuire had been utterly silent during this encounter. Now she sprang from her table of herbs as if scalded. She knelt then, and Lutz saw something he hadn't noticed before. Under the table was a large wicker basket lined with woolen blankets. Nestled sleeping in the blankets was a tiny, swaddled infant. She snatched up the basket and fled into the house without another word. Bud had turned, the shotgun still balanced on his shoulder, and said, "This is my property. Ain't no crime been committed. You got no right to be here." All of this was said in the same eerie, deadpan voice. Bud's words, spoken in the same eerie, deadpan voice, were all true. April McGuire had not accused Bud of anything. It wasn't against the law to hold a firearm while standing on your own land. There was nothing more for Lutz to say, so he retreated back to the cruiser and headed back to the station. He hadn't returned to the McGuire property since that day nearly 8 years ago. The McGuires had been seen no more than a handful of times in those 8 years, most often driving in Bud's battered Dodge Ram as the family returned or drove away along Highway 99. At some point, another child, a daughter, was added to their number. Neither child was ever seen at the local public school or the local Christian school.
The soil, that thick black Midwestern soil, failed Bud McGuire. Corn, beans, wheat, every crop he planted seemed to wither and die at his touch. His fellow farmers prospered. The rich soil of the land is sprouting healthy rows of strong green corn, seemingly overnight. Despite all of this, Bud somehow managed to land himself a wife. In the fall of 1977, a mere 15 months after Bud came back from the war, a pale slip of a girl was seen hanging laundry on the front lawn of the McGuire farm. She had long, mousy brown hair and wide blue eyes that were forever fixed on the ground. Who she was, where she came from, was anyone's guess. This would have maddened the women of the community, all of whom were obsessed with lineage, but no information on the girl could be found. She was just there one day, silently feeding chickens or beating rugs. She never came into town, never spoke
to anyone. The second time Andrew Lutz encountered Bud McGuire in a professional capacity had been about a year after the arrival of this mysterious woman. The locals had thrown their hands up in exasperation. All of their kind gestures and housewarming casseroles had been met with a closed door. The McGuires had never been seen attending any of the many churches in the community, nor had the young woman appeared at the supermarket where the wives could pounce on her. The initial confusion had given way to righteous indignation. Who did they think they were, holed up all high and mighty on their plot of land? Did the McGuires think they were too good to associate with their peers? But as the weeks dragged on, and still there was no sight of the young woman in town, winter set in, and she was no longer seen outside by the few people who drove on the old county road. The offended feelings of the townspeople began to shift into concern. Was she okay? After all, Buddy had always had quite the temper, even before his years in the jungles of Vietnam. Finally, in the spring of '78, the wives nagged their husbands until the husbands had called the city police. The police in turn called the sheriff's department to tell them that someone needed to go check on that girl to soothe the nerves of their worried neighbors. Lutz had been the junior deputy on duty at the time and had set off up Highway 99 to the McGuire Farm. Barely 3 miles from the floodplains of the Mississippi River, the ground in March was a quagmire of mud that had sucked at Lutz's boots as he stepped out of the police cruiser. The house was a traditional farmhouse, 2 stories, with sweeping gables that rose to create a 3rd story in the attic. A large wraparound porch upheld by thick wooden beams led up to the entrance. Lutz had looked around warily before climbing the stairs to the porch. He had knocked twice. No answer. This had been expected, and Lutz turned away from the house and went instead around the back, where sure enough, a petite young woman was sorting fresh spring herbs into an array of bowls. She had bristled like a startled cat when she caught sight of him, and Lutz had held his hands in front of him to show he meant no harm. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Deputy Lutz. I'm with the Sheriff's Department. Can I ask your name?" He spoke in a low, gentle voice, taking very slow steps toward the girl. She had not budged. Many times Lutz had driven slowly down the county road, hoping to see April McGuire or her children out in the yard. But the house had been shuttered and silent, and Lutz had been forced to keep driving. Over the years, most of the people in the community had long since stopped gossiping about the McGuires. Everyone sympathized with the lonely young woman isolated with her children and Bud's anger. But these were also a conservative group who prized their right to privacy. As long as there was no apparent problem at the McGuire farm, everyone merely shook their heads and went about their lives, even though they all knew what the ultimate outcome was likely to be. As Sheriff Andrew Lutz neared the McGuire homestead,
he was cursing himself for not doing more, for not inventing some ridiculous reason to go check on April and her children. He only hoped he wasn't too late. But it didn't look as though that were the case. Sir, the voice of Billy Hudson suddenly snapped Andrew Lutz out of his guilt and grief. Consumed by his ghoulish thoughts, he was about to miss the blind curve in the road leading up to Bud's farm. The heavy police cruiser was instead aimed directly at a large pine tree. Lutz twisted the steering wheel violently, and the ponderous car screeched its resistance to such treatment, fishtailing wildly across the road in long, snaking arcs before he was able to get control. Heart hammering from the near miss, the sheriff pointed the car at the shallow gravel shoulder and pulled over. His hands were clutching the steering wheel in a white-knuckle grip, and it took a moment of effort to release them. He killed the engine, and for a long moment the only sound was the quiet ticking of the engine as it cooled. Ahead of this curve, the trees would open on one side at the beginning of the McGuire Farm. Sir? The voice of Billy Hudson suddenly snapped Andrew Lutz out of his guilt and grief. Consumed by his ghoulish thoughts, he was about to miss the blind curve in the road leading up to Bud's farm. The heavy police cruiser was instead aimed directly at a large pine tree. Lutz twisted the steering wheel violently, and the ponderous car screeched its resistance to such treatment, fishtailing wildly across the road in long, snaking arcs before he was able to get control. Heart hammering from the near miss, the sheriff pointed the car at the shallow gravel shoulder and pulled over. His hands were clutching the steering wheel in a white-knuckle grip, and it took a moment of effort to release them. He killed the engine, and for a long moment the only sound was the quiet ticking of the engine as it cooled. Ahead of this curve, the trees would open on one side at the beginning of the McGuire Farm. Immediately, something felt off, and the flesh on Lutz's arms crawled. He motioned for Clarkson to join him and released Billy from his cage in the back seat. Crossing to the trunk, Lutz pulled out the rifle and handed it to Deputy Clarkson. He grabbed the shotgun and 2 high-beam flashlights before closing the trunk. With a nod of understanding, he passed the shotgun and one of the flashlights to Billy Hudson. All of the boys and most of the girls in this region learned to shoot before they were 10 years old. Knowledge of firearms and firearm safety was deeply ingrained in a community where almost everyone's deep freezers were stocked full of fresh venison every autumn. Lutz felt no hesitation about handing the shotgun to the younger man. The kid had sense, even if he was overly fond of drag racing.
His driver's side door was still open. Lutz reached in to turn off the headlights, then thought twice. The dim light was all they had beside the heavy maglite he now carried opposite his service pistol. He left the cruiser's lights running, closed the door to the car with a heavy thud, and the 3 of them turned to survey their surroundings. That odd feeling was still creeping up the back of Lutz's neck, but it was Billy who was able to give voice to his unease. "All the bugs are quiet," the young man whispered. Lutz listened carefully and realized he was right. This was high summer, The air was thick and humid, and it should have been filled with the chirps of insects. The nightly concerto of katydids, cicadas, and crickets was usually enough to drive a man half mad. But here, there wasn't so much as the buzz of a mosquito. The only sound was the quiet tapping of the men's boots as they began walking north towards Bud McGuire's home. The light from the headlights didn't fail to penetrate the gloom ahead, and Lutz clicked on the high-powered maglite. Next to him, Billy shouldered the shotgun, his smaller flashlight pressed with one hand under the barrel. Deputy Clarkson was at ready with the long Winchester rifle at his shoulder. Normally used when a deputy needed to put down a wounded animal on the side of the highway, Lutz was immensely grateful just now for its solidly reliable presence. Lutz swept the flashlight in slow, careful strokes from one edge of the road to another. "Where did you say you saw this arm now, son?" he asked Billy. A little farther ahead, I think. Maybe another 300 feet or so." Billy's voice came from his right. Lutz continued methodically sweeping his flashlight from side to side. At the edge of the beam, he could make out the burnt rubber made by tires suddenly skidding across the road. The tracks continued up the road, fading away into the darkness. The men were now far enough away from the relative safety of the car that its dim headlights could no longer assist in penetrating the gloom ahead. The beams from the two flashlights seemed to grow smaller and fainter as they walked in loose formation up the road. Abruptly, the burnt rubber skids made by Billy's tires came to an end about 6 feet in front of them. The three men all stopped together, staring dumbfoundedly ahead. In the beam of Billy's flashlight, on the edge of the road as it faded into scrub grass, was the arm of a human female. It had been torn crudely at the elbow, and bloody strings of meat hung from one end. The other end was wearing a thin gold wedding band around the ring finger. The nails were chipped and embedded with dirt. All the blood in his body seemed to rush to his head, and Lutz could feel his heartbeat pounding sickeningly in his temples. Deputy Clarkson gave a violent heave and turned to vomit quietly into the ditch on the other side of the highway. Lutz squatted down on his haunches near the severed arm and reached for the ballpoint pen he kept in his shirt pocket. Turning his head to take one more breath of unfouled air, he used the pen to lift one of the strips of flesh away from the wound. It had been almost shredded, and for one horrifying instant, the image of Lutz's late wife's venison jerky came to his mind. Sour bile rose in his throat, and he fought against the urge to puke.
What animal could do this to a person? What animal would bother? To his knowledge, there had never been reports of bear in this area, and any wolves had been killed off generations ago. Coyotes would take a chicken or a duck once in a while, but Lutz couldn't recall a single instance of them going after a small child, let alone a grown woman. Besides, these weren't the teeth or claw marks of a coyote. Whatever had done this had had much longer teeth. A sudden snap from the forest on his left. Lutz's blood turned to ice in his veins. Clarkson heard it too. His rifle was back at his shoulder in an instant, and he took a hesitant step towards the looming blackness. Next to him, Billy Hudson was utterly rigid, his fingers deathly white around the grip of the shotgun. Another snap in the darkness. Had that one been closer? He quickly swung the beam of the flashlight away from the grisly scene on the road in the direction of the woods. It illuminated skeletal pine trees and waist-high thorn bushes. The light shone eerily on the narrow trunks of the pines. With their ladders of broken branches, the trees became rows of menacing spears waiting to impale unwary travelers. The unnatural silence of the woods was oppressive. Lutz peered into the darkness, willing the shadows to separate into shapes. He focused on the edges of the light, where it faded into a thick and impenetrable blackness. He thought he could see shapes in the dark, looming patches of shadow that were somehow blacker than the night. A hulking figure dancing just out of his field of vision. But nothing came charging at them from out of the woods, and after a long moment, Lutz relaxed his posture. Telling himself unconvincingly that it had been a deer, Lutz turned back to Billy. They now had evidence of a death, but not necessarily evidence of a crime. There was still work to be done before they could all go back home. "Did you say there were more bodies?" Billy hesitated for a long moment and then replied, "Yes, maybe. I don't know, just come see for yourselves." Clarkson looked bewildered by the answer, but rolled his eyes and shrugged. "Let's get this done, Sheriff. This place gives me the fucking creeps." Hearing his deputy admit his apprehension somehow served to boost Lutz's own confidence. The forest was now at his back, and he felt watchful eyes on them, but he shook off his nerves. Nodding affirmation at Billy, he confirmed, "Let's get this the fuck over with and go home." Leaving the lone, pitiful arm on the side of the highway, the men now began skirting the edge of the cornfield that bordered Bud McGuire's home. The corn, which should have towered over them at a full height of 16 feet, was sickly looking and scrawny. This actually offered Lutz some comfort. The weakened stalks of the malnourished crops made it easier for the beam of his maglite to pierce the fields.
Looming ahead, set back nearly a quarter-mile from the edge of the highway, was the McGuire house. At first, it looked much the same as when Lutz had paid his visit 8 years previously. But the disrepair of the home became increasingly apparent as they turned on to the loose gravel driveway. At the start of the path was a rust-eaten mailbox, leaning precariously on its weathered post. The McGuires had obviously failed to keep up with their correspondence. He wondered idly how Bud took care of things like electricity and plumbing if bills never came to their house. The main house must have been truly lovely in some bygone age. Its frame was a clean and crisp colonial, with gabled windows and a large wraparound porch, but the clean lines were obscured by a sagging roof and missing shutters. The porch was also drooping, with a dilapidated wicker couch sitting neglected to one corner. What must once have been cheerful white paint and blue trimming was now gray and peeling in great strips from the wood. The whole house had an air of exhaustion, like a once proud old horse that no longer had the energy to hold its head up in the traces. The front door was hanging open by one twisted hinge. As the men approached, Lutz held up one hand curled into a fist as a signal to hold position. His earlier jitters had cleared away, replaced by the curiously detached feeling he always felt when he was approaching a crime scene that's sure to be unpleasant.
Normally, it was a high school kid who partied too hard and wrapped his car around a tree, or a trucker who came home drunk and decided to put his wife in the morgue. After 30 years in the sheriff's department, Lutz was no stranger to the violence inherent in men. It wasn't a man that tore off that child's arm, though. As if to confirm this chilling thought, Lutz shined his flashlight on the broken door of the house, scratched deep into the wood, deep enough that the door was nearly splintered into pieces, were 4 parallel gouges running from the top of the doorframe to the bottom corner in one long, unbroken arc. The aluminum doorknob was twisted out of shape and hung uselessly to one side. Beyond the door lay only more blackness. Deputy Clarkson had been a wonderfully good sport up until this point, but when presented with the prospect of crossing the threshold of this house, he balked. He released his death grip on his rifle, lowering it to his side and exclaiming, "No offense, Sheriff, but fuck this. I'm not going in there. Let's go back to the car and call..." "Call who, Henry?" Lutz said flatly. "The state troopers can't do anything except write tickets to out-of-towners. The town police call us when there is a violent death. So who exactly should we call? Animal control?"
Clarkson glowered back at him. "Then let's go back to the car and come back in the goddamn daylight," he hissed between clenched teeth. Personally, Lutz felt that Clarkson was speaking the most sense that anyone had all night. But as much as he privately agreed with his deputy's plan to retreat far away from the McGuire house, they were there and there was a job to be done. "Come on now, Henry. Billy's been inside. Can't let the kid show us up now, can we?" Lutz said with a forced lightheartedness that rang false in his ears. He sighed, ran one hand along his forehead and through his salt and pepper hair, and tried again. "Yeah, this sucks. Doesn't change facts. We have to find out what, if anything, occurred here tonight. So let's just sack up and get it done, yeah?" It wasn't much of a pep talk, but it seemed to do the trick. Billy gave a heavy shrug, scuffing his boots against the brown grass bordering the McGuire's front porch. Clarkson closed his eyes for a moment, as if offering up a silent prayer, then re-shouldered his firearm and nodded at Lutz. "I'm taking a long weekend," he stated matter-of-factly. "I'm going to go to Red Lobster. It's Crab Fest." He continued muttering to himself about his upcoming weekend, but brushed past Lutz and climbed the creaking steps onto the porch. "You can have the whole week off," Lutz mentally promised his deputy. Then he pulled his revolver out of its holster, thumbed the safety off, and followed the 2 men past the entrance and into Bud McGuire's home. A profound silence settled around the men as they crossed the threshold of the McGuire house. The footsteps made by the officer's heavy boots were muffled by the layer of dust that lay upon the floor. In the beam of the flashlight, the wallpaper in the foyer may have been a sunny striped yellow at some point, but had been warped with water damage and was now the color of old urine. Ahead of the men was a long corridor with a doorway on either side.
On one side, Lutz could see the ubiquitous farmhouse mudroom, complete with rows of rubber Wellington boots and heavy winter parkas. The wellies were dull and cracked with disuse, and the coats were moth-eaten and smelled of damp. A closed door led deeper into the house, probably into the kitchen. On the left side of the corridor was a room Lutz's wife would have referred to as a parlor when she was alive, with delicate furniture and assorted porcelain figurines. Here was the first evidence of human activity. The dainty tables were smashed to bits, and the rose-patterned love seat was at a defined angle to a moth-eaten rug, as if someone had forcibly shifted the couch by standing with sudden force. A broken water jug lay in pieces on the floor. Oddly enough, even these violent scenes were gentled by a thick layer of dust. So far, the only sign that a living person had been in the house were the tracks I could see in the corridor that had clearly been made by Billy's heavy boots. Where were the McGuires?
Lutz moved on a constant pivot, shining his high-powered flashlight into every corner and crevice. His senses felt electrified as he strained each one of his senses to determine whether or not a threat still lurked in this house. According to his eyes and ears, this was just a normal house, though terribly neglected. "Billy," he whispered under his breath, "why the fuck did you even come in here?" Billy responded equally quietly, "Like I said, sir, I thought maybe someone was in trouble. But when I got here, it was like I just had to keep going. I had to see for myself." Lutz understood. He could feel it too. The panicky urge to head back for the car was drowned out by grim determination. He needed to find out what the hell had happened here. Past the open doorways to the mudroom and the parlor was a flight of stairs that went from the first floor all the way to the attic in a long switchback. The stairs, like everything else in the McGuire house, seemed to be standing upright by sheer force of will alone. Running along the right edge of the staircase, in a long, unbroken line from top to bottom, was a wide swath of dried blood. The first thought that ran through Sheriff Lutz's mind in that moment was that he wished he lived in a larger city with more resources. If they were further north, near Des Moines or Cedar Rapids, the three men standing in the McGuire house could be surrounded by backup within an hour. A small fleet of detectives, forensic experts, photographers, evidence baggers, and rubberneckers could gather at the homestead. The living darkness of the August summer night would be beaten back by high-powered flashbulbs and battery-powered spotlights. Under their harsh glare, and soothed by the shop talk of the gathered officials, whatever horrors had visited the McGuire family would be revealed as just another crime scene, still tragic but acceptable to the mind. A sane sequence of events. Unfortunately, his little pocket of eastern Iowa was small and underpopulated. The mechanics needed to properly investigate a potential crime were simply not in place. As much as Lutz dreaded the idea, it would have to be him that ventured up those stairs, and it would have to be now. He would have to venture up there, and so would Clarkson, as department regulations forbade an officer from entering a potential crime scene alone. Plus,
He wanted Clarkson's steady presence beside him with the Winchester. That didn't mean they all had to go. "Billy," Lutz said to the young man without turning, "if you don't want to go up there a second time, now is your chance. Go wait for us on the porch. Stand guard." "With all due respect, sir, there is no way I am staying down here by myself." Billy squared his shoulders and gave Lutz a defiant look. "Your choice, kid." Lutz gave him a nod and turned back to the problem of the staircase. They would have to make sure they didn't contaminate the crime scene with their boots. The blood was thick all the way down the stairs, where it abruptly stopped on the second-to-last riser. Here, a slightly thicker pool of blood still shone with faint wetness under his flashlight.
Whatever had happened here had happened recently. Slow and steady does it now. Don't step in it. Squeezing his lanky frame to the far edge of the staircase, Lutz placed a heavy boot on the first riser. A puff of dust arose, and the stair gave a wheezing groan, but it did not buckle under his weight. Lutz began slowly advancing his way up the stairs, pressing firmly on each stair first to test its stability. The staircase creaked and moaned, but continued to hold firm, and he motioned for Clarkson to follow. Lutz could hear his usually taciturn deputy muttering various prayers and swear words under his breath. The swath of blood continued up the stairs in an unbroken streak. Now it veered off to the right and disappeared into the darkness of a long corridor. The overwhelming odor was of dirt and mold, but the coppery smell of fresh blood was also thick in the air. A few framed photos hung at uneven intervals, their subjects almost completely obscured with dust. The dust on the floor was disturbed now, but there were no distinct tracks. It had been swept almost clean away in some places. Resigned now to seeing this through, Lutz felt his earlier fear retreat to the back of his mind. The adrenaline pumping through his system was working for him now, sharpening his focus and steadying his pulse. The corridor opened twice to the right, and Lutz circled warily around the open entrance to the first room. A cursory glance revealed a dingy bathroom, or perhaps it had once been a bathroom. Now it was a heap of stained and cracked porcelain, with a rusted-out pipe hanging loosely where a sink may have been. Torn linoleum covered parts of the floor, but most of it was the same weathered floorboards as the rest of the upstairs. The air was heavy with the smells of stale grime and mildew. The path of blood, which had become thicker as they advanced along the corridor, continued down the hallway to the second room. Lutz signaled to Billy to cover the entrance of the bathroom. Then he and Clarkson advanced, firearms cocked and ready. Lutz still carried the maglite held to the top of his service pistol, so he was the first to cautiously peer around the corner of the room at the end of the hall. When Lutz first shone his flashlight into the darkened room, he actually breathed a sigh of relief. He had expected to find the strewn and dismembered bodies
of April McGuire and her children in pieces about the floor. Instead, the room appeared entirely empty on first glance. There were no severed limbs clad in footy pajamas. There was also no furniture, curtains, rugs, or anything else to indicate that the space had ever been occupied by inhabitants other than mice. The bare wooden floor was littered with their droppings, but not much else. He began sweeping his flashlight from floor to ceiling. The walls had been painted a deep scarlet that looked almost wet by the light of the... For a span of time that felt like an eternity, but was in reality probably more than 30 seconds, Lutz stood stock still in the entrance to that room, his head cocked to one side like a man trying to figure out a really good riddle. One eyebrow was raised, and his mouth hung open in bewilderment.
The room had been drenched in great splashes of blood that reached all the way to the ceiling in some places. It was swirled in sporadic circles across the floor and spattered against all four walls. The closest thing Lutz could compare it to. Behind him, Lutz could hear Clarkson's sharp intake of breath as he also took in the scene before them. Then it was as if all the air went out of his lungs, and Sheriff Lutz suddenly deflated. He felt his knees give way and had to lean one hand against the outside wall of the hallway for support, as his vision blurred and his head spun. He still held the flashlight in one hand, and it was pointed into the room, shining onto the dripping walls. He felt more than saw Clarkson stumble backwards into the wall behind him. Billy stood at the doorway to the demolished bathroom, studying the mud on his boots. Lutz realized that the younger man had already seen all of this. "Billy, did you see any bodies when you were here earlier?" "When I saw the blood on the stairs, I figured maybe someone was still alive up here. But when I got up here, there was nothing. The batteries in my flashlight was starting to die, and then I saw that room." He gestured towards the room with the bloody walls. "I got the hell out of here quick as I could. I didn't check any of the other rooms." "So then where the fuck are the bodies? It looks like Bud McGuire in a salad spinner. There's blood on the goddamn ceiling," Clarkson queried, stepping closer to the open door of the empty room and glancing inside once more. "Yeah, but that's the problem. It's blood, just blood. No bones, no organs." Lutz's mind was still spinning as it frantically tried to bring a sense of logic into what it had just witnessed. There should be pieces of the McGuires everywhere. So far, the only evidence of an actual crime is that arm out in the road. He turned to face the other two men, continuing to speak under his breath. Clarkson faced him, his normally placid face a mask of tension and fear. "Yeah, how did that arm even get out there? Why does it look like no one has lived here in 5 years? Where the hell are the McGuires?" This last sentence he said in a whispered shout. "Are they in the barn? The basement? Did Bud chop them up and carry them into the woods? Was it even Bud? What the hell were those claw marks on the door, Sheriff?" Lutz gripped his deputy tightly by the shoulders,
his own fear gone in the face of his officers' increasing panic. "Of course it was Bud, Henry. We'll find him, don't worry." This idea, as nightmarish as it was, offered a kind of morbid comfort. Bud McGuire might be a deranged madman who had just killed his entire family, but he was a man. The man bled when you shot him. This whole time, Billy Hudson had been silent, his eyes fixed on the open doorway to the dingy bathroom. Now Billy cleared his throat and almost sheepishly said, "Sheriff, you might want to see this. Had there ever been less welcome words in human history?" Lutz pinched his nose between two fingers and reluctantly asked, "What is it?" Billy just gestured with the head of the shotgun, and in the bright glow from his maglite, Lutz could see a thin line of blood slowly making its way from behind the open bathroom door. Immediately his heart, which had just begun to resume its regularly scheduled beat, started jackhammering wildly in his chest. Somehow, in that moment, Lutz knew. Whatever they had come here to find was on the other side of that door. On their first walkthrough of the corridor, all three men had been preoccupied by the path of blood that led to the room at the end of the hall. Now, upon closer inspection, Lutz realized that there was the faintest glimmer of light coming from the darkened bathroom. His mouth was dry as a bone, and Lutz swallowed hard, and then, pistol still at the ready, he eased around the doorway of the bathroom and put his back against the nearest wall. He checked the corner and, finding it empty, proceeded to circle slowly around the room. Clarkson covered him from behind, while Billy stood guard once more outside the room. The light was coming from two flickering candles, the tall glass ones of the sort his grandmother used to burn on Sundays. The flames were sputtering their last breaths, and two more candles had already drowned in their own wax. How long do those candles burn? Lutz made a mental note and kept his eyes on a swivel, trying to observe as much as possible about the scene. The candles had been arranged next to a chipped green bathtub. They formed a small circle, in the middle of which was a blackened circle, as someone had foolishly decided to build a fire in the middle of the floor. On the edge of the bathtub was a draped, faded calico dress. Lutz approached the garment, which had been carefully arranged so as not to wrinkle against the sides of the tub. The tub itself was empty. Lutz suddenly froze as he heard Clarkson swear a low oath behind him. Filled with sudden dread, he pivoted instinctively on his heel and prepared to fire. For the first time that night, Andrew Lutz screamed at the top of his lungs. Slumped in one corner of the trashed bathroom, in a slowly spreading pool of blood, was what remained of Bud McGuire. Lutz couldn't tear his eyes away from the gruesome sight.
Bud McGuire's face was frozen in a silent shriek, wide eyes fixed unblinking at the ceiling. His chest had been torn open crudely, the glinting white of ribs poked through the carnage. Bud's legs were bent at an impossible angle to his torso. He had been torn almost in two at the groin. The first scream that passed Sheriff Lutz's lips was quickly followed by a second. He fell backwards to the ground and landed hard upon his rear, using the heels of his feet to push himself away from the mutilated corpse. His back pressed against the rusted green bathtub, and he idly noticed that the calico dress laying across the edge had a faint pattern of purple violets. Then Clarkson's strong brown hands were wrapped around his own, and his deputy hauled Lutz to his feet. They exited the broken bathroom and its grisly contents and went into the corridor, where Billy Hudson was already halfway down the stairs leading to the first floor. The ancient staircase creaked threatening beneath their boots as the two officers followed the younger man downstairs, desperate to get as far away from Bud McGuire's mutilated corpse as possible. Lutz burst out still open front door and stumbled down the porch steps. The humid summer air was like a soothing balm against his skin. His lungs heaved with the effort to draw in fresh breath, and he sank to his knees, digging his fists into the hard gravel of the walkway. He could hear the footsteps of Deputy Clarkson and Billy sounding down the stairs and out onto the front lawn. They remained mercifully silent as Lutz fought against the waves of heat and chills that kept alternating their way through his veins. Distantly, as if observing someone else from far above, Lutz understood that he was having a panic attack. With shaking arms, he shifted his weight until he was sitting on the lawn bordering the front path. Dry grass crackled as he brought his knees up to his forehead and sat there, breathing in the night air. Somewhere nearby, a cricket chirped. Crickets were still chirping. Somehow, this was an encouraging thought. Lutz raised his head and looked for a moment at the night sky. The sun was still hours away from rising, and the sky was pitch black except for the thousands of glittering stars. Lutz took a deep breath and held it for a long moment before slowly exhaling. He repeated this steady breathing twice more, then wearily got to his feet, wincing as both his knees cracked in protest. He brushed dry grass off the pants of his uniform and looked at his companions, both of whom had remained silently nearby this entire time. Nodding once in silent gratitude, Lutz resumed his authority as sheriff. None of them would speak a word of his temporary breakdown, but they could all feel a sudden shift in the atmosphere, as if a sudden bond of kinship had just been forged. Lutz knew that the three of them would forever be bound by the events of this night.
Officer Clarkson looked to his senior officer. Do you want to check the rest of the property? Look for the rest of the family." Lutz began shaking his head almost immediately. "No, we found what we were looking for. This is officially a crime scene. It's also a 40-acre farm with 2 barns and at least 10 outbuildings. We need more men." "You want to call in Miller and Sanchez?" Clarkson asked. Lutz nodded but then shook his head. "Yeah, we'll call the men when we get back to the station. No radio signal out here worth a damn anyway. Besides, I think we also need to get on the phone with the mayor's office. We're going to need the forensics people in Iowa City or Davenport or wherever the hell." At this, Sheriff Lutz turned and began walking back the way they had come. He glanced back once more at the darkened windows of the McGuire farmhouse, which now seemed like looming eyes in the receding light from their flashlights. His boots crunched under the rough gravel of the long driveway as the 3 men headed back towards the car. The yellow, sickly-looking corn blocked their view on either side, looming far taller than a man, even in this unhealthy state. Lutz was struck again by the eerie silence of the place. The humid summer air was heavy and still. Not a breath of wind rustled through the stalks. The near-complete absence of sound made him antsy and uncomfortable. The sooner they were back to the car, the better. Billy must have felt the same way. He trotted up alongside Lutz, his rifle loosely grasped in one hand now that they were out of the farmhouse. In a low voice, he said, "What will happen now, Sheriff?" Lutz shrugged. "First, we're going to go back to the station. I have a bottle of Lagavulin 16 in a locked box in my office. Sheriff Bradley gave me that bottle the day I took office. Now, he told me this whiskey was peaty enough and smoky enough to burn away the worst night of your life. Told me there would someday come the night when I would need it. It sat in its wooden box every night until I really started to think that day would never come. But it did, and tonight I'm going to open that bottle and drink deep, and you'll drink with me if you like." Heartened by this prospect, the men picked up the pace, and within a few minutes they emerged from the McGuire's driveway back onto the smooth paved surface of Highway 99. Like an angel in the darkness, Lutz could see the police cruiser sitting on the edge of the road about 300 yards down. He breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that some secret part of him had expected the black and white Chevy to be gone, leaving them stranded at the McGuire farmhouse. Lutz's palms were sweating, and he wiped them furtively on the thighs of his trousers. He checked his watch, then checked it again in disbelief. They had barely been gone 40 minutes.
When they reached the car, Lutz fumbled in his pocket for his keys, then unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, and he wondered briefly if he was fit to drive. "Can't exactly ask Clarkson or Billy to chauffeur me home," he thought resignedly. Lutz unlocked the passenger and back doors, and his companions slid silently into their seats. Clarkson was still holding the buck rifle, and the shotgun was in Billy's lap, the mounted flashlight still beaming a bright circle on the car's upholstery. As one, the men fastened their seatbelts. The familiar, everyday click of the metal sliding into place struck him as utterly absurd after the night's events. Lutz slid the key to the Chevy into the engine. He had a horrible, crawling feeling in the bottom of his stomach that when he turned the key, the engine would simply refuse to start.
This was ridiculous, since the cruiser was barely 3 years old and had never done anything but purr like a kitten. But tonight, right now, the car wouldn't start because it couldn't be this easy to just drive away. The key turned, and the motor roared into life, just as it always did. The front headlights came on, casting 2 wide beams of darkness around them. Reflecting back, impossibly high against the skeletal pines of the forest, were a pair of glowing red eyes. Clarkson screamed first, throwing his hands over his face and crying out in terror. Lutz couldn't scream. His voice seemed to have completely locked itself away. His mouth gaped open in horror, but the only sound that came out was a strangled choke. Billy was scrambling to get out of the police cruiser, but since he was in the back, the doors only opened from the outside. He tried rolling down the window, and when that failed, he began to panic and bashed at the glass with his fist again and again, but this was equally ineffective. Billy raised the butt of the shotgun and drew back, preparing to ram it through the window of the car. "No!" Lutz roared, never taking his eyes from the glowing red orbs watching them from the forest. He jammed the clutch in, praying to anyone who might be listening that the car did not stall. He shifted into first, gave the engine some gas, and the car began slowly moving. This entire time, he continued staring at the red eyes hovering 20 feet above them. They looked back unwaveringly, glittering with a malevolent intelligence. As the cruiser rolled past, the eyes followed their progress, but did not advance. Lutz fixed his gaze on the rearview mirror, waiting for some ravenous beast to come charging behind them. But there was nothing. The darkness of the night took over, and the eyes receded into the trees. Intent now on putting as much distance between himself and the McGuire farm as possible, Lutz laid one heavy boot on the gas. Only after 10 miles, when he could see the lights of Harry Gibson's fuel station, did he ease his boot off the accelerator and relax the hunched position of his shoulders. 10 minutes later, they pulled up to the darkened windows of the sheriff's station.
Lutz killed the engine of the cruiser, and the 3 men sat in silence. After a long moment, Henry Clarkson opened his mouth. "What was that thing?" he began, but Lutz put up a hand and stopped him. Lutz shook his head, opened the door of the cruiser with a loud creak, and stepped outside. Every muscle in his body was accusing him of gross misconduct, and Lutz knew he would feel the punishment the next day. He unlocked the door to the sheriff's office and went in. The comfortable surroundings of the dingy sheriff's station almost brought him to tears. Weakly buzzing security fluorescents cast a dim yellowish glow on the familiar disarray of desks and chairs. Without bothering to turn on the main lights, he crossed the bullpen to the corner office at the back of the station and went inside his office. On the bookcase against the far wall was a narrow wooden box, which Lutz now opened for the first time in 10 years. Nestled against dark silk was the bottle of Lagavulin 16, given to him by retiring Sheriff Bradley on his last day in office. There will come a day when you need it. Lutz motioned to Clarkson and Billy, who had followed him into the station and now stood silently behind him, framing the door to his office.
Clarkson had fetched 3 glasses from the small kitchen, and he set them down carefully on the stained wood of Lutz's desk. Andrew Lutz sat heavily in his black office chair. He twisted the cap off the bottle of scotch and poured 3 fingers into each glass. The amber liquid glinted dully in the dim light. The powerful, peaty smell of the alcohol bit into his nose as he raised his glass, and the 2 men in front of him raised theirs. "Drink up," he advised. In one smooth motion, all 3 of them drained their glasses. The scotch blazed a fiery trail to his stomach to burn the nightmares away. He reached to refill his glass.